Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thanks all for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here speaking with Carol and John about autonomous cars, the potential future for autonomous commuting, and where we think technology is today and where the technology may be going and how it may affect us in our everyday lives. Maybe just to kick us off, I'm actually really curious to hear from both of you about where do you think your sort of perception is of where autonomous technology in regards to autonomous driving is today? And what do you think some of your expectations are for the future? Maybe, John, I'll have you start off, given the work that you've been doing.
Sure, that sounds good. I think my remarks will focus mostly on the technology along with a little bit about the applications. But I think, of course, there's been a revolution in autonomous driving. There are a lot of companies that have been established, and there's a fairly mature autonomy architecture that's being used, which has a perception component, motion planning, control, behaviors. There's a pretty strong software development process that's been developed. There are some fairly well-accepted testing protocols and routines, although we'll probably have more to say about that in terms of the needed safety that we have to have in autonomous driving. The deep learning revolution has really improved perception capabilities. So that's something that just within recent years has been pushing things along. And then I think one thing that is important to keep in mind about the current status of autonomous driving is that there's a strong distinction between highway driving, which is far less complicated than urban situations, and then urban environments, in which a lot of unusual and surprising things can happen. So that's just a brief statement of where things are now. And I guess, well, we'll probably get a chance to talk later about, how soon will it be widespread and all those kinds of things. For the future, I think we'll see continued, probably gradual progress. I think one way to characterize the current situation is that maybe 95% or a little bit more, all of the relatively straightforward situations can be dealt with reasonably well, but we're still working on a lot of difficult situations, such as the ones in urban environments. There'll be increasing use of vehicle-to-vehicle technology and vehicle-to-infrastructure, which has benefits. And there's a question of where will the killer apps be, or the places that it'll be introduced first. And I think long-range trucking is one, and there are a lot of companies working on that. Last mile delivery is a good application as well. And ride sharing, as we know, Uber and others have been involved with that. And the last thing I'd say about the future is that without solving in a better way than we've been able to so far the safety problem, progress will be mixed or difficult. So that's an important aspect of it. So that's all I have to say initially about it. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Carol.
Yeah, and building on that, yeah, it's still early days. There's just so much work to be done. There are a lot of hard problems that need to be worked on, and just thinking about what is safe legally, personally. We all have different ideas of what that is, and thinking through that. And what is appropriate for the vehicle, aggressive driving versus more conservative driving. Those things are going to vary, and people will have different preferences. And then thinking about the norms for the communities as well. Driving in a very large city is very different than driving in a smaller city. Here in Pittsburgh, we have the Pittsburgh left, which having a vehicle understand that is probably difficult at best. But I'm very hopeful that this technology is going to come to fruition sooner rather than later. I would really like my kids to drive a lot less than I have in my life. It's not the safest activity that we do, certainly, and these vehicles have the opportunity, the potential to save many, many lives eventually. But to John's points about the safety issues, we really have to determine better ways of keeping people safe, because the vigilance tasks they're required in the current vehicles is really insurmountable for now, as far as safety concerns.
Carol, if you wouldn't mind, just for our guests here, for who may have never visited Pittsburgh, could you describe the Pittsburgh left? And also, I noted that you had talked a little bit about the vigilance problem. Would you mind just describing what that is, just so everyone's on the same page?
Certainly. Yeah, the Pittsburgh left is an odd one to think about, but if you can imagine a two-lane road where traffic is going in both directions, and if you are paused to turn left into a road, the oncoming traffic that you're facing will actually stop and allow you to make that left turn, which in many cities I've lived in is not possible. It's not even a thing. And here it's very common for a bus even to stop and allow you to turn left in front of them. My experience in Chicago was not that. A bus was much more likely to just run you over and keep going. And so Pittsburgh has this unique thing, and there are those things that are community specific all over the world, where there may or may not be even any visual indications of what is happening, but people have an understanding. They have a shared experience, and they know how things work in their city. And then on the vigilance tasks, so vigilance tasks, if you can imagine a security guard, they are watching and waiting for something to happen. If they're watching screens in an office building, let's say, that task is very difficult to continue for long periods of time. You're waiting, nothing is happening. In TV shows, it's common to see somebody with their feet up on the desk and they're reading a book because it's just so boring. And that's the task we're asking people to do, and not just to protect a building, but rather to protect themselves, to protect their children, to protect their parents, whoever it is that's in the vehicle. They're being asked to wait, and then immediately respond when the vehicle needs them at the utmost urgency to save their lives. And that is nearly impossible for humans to do. It's just, we aren't made to respond in that way with that kind of urgency, from a point of not at all really needing to pay attention. It's just a really difficult thing for humans to do.
Great, thanks. So actually, as part of also your what you were talking about earlier, you'd mentioned that you're hoping maybe that your children wouldn't have to get driver's licenses. Can you share a little bit more about what actually motivated you to start working in the area of autonomous vehicle development, and how you sort of got started?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So I live here in Pittsburgh, and I live in a neighborhood where I could see the early vehicles driving around, the early autonomous vehicles that various groups were working on, and was just very excited about this technology. It seemed like it was improving literally on a regular basis. I was seeing new prototypes driving around, and was just getting more and more excited about it, and had the opportunity to go to Uber's ATG group, where they were working on self-driving cars, and was very excited to do research there and really try to figure out what would enable trust, what we could do to help people to appropriately trust the vehicles, to be able to understand what the vehicle was doing, why it was doing what it was doing, and to help them get where they needed to go. I really, again, am still extremely hopeful about these technologies, particularly for people with disabilities, to have more independence, to not have to explain anything to another human, but rather to just get in the vehicle and go where they need to go. Huge potential, but and that's why I got into this work. And also, I just feel it really is going to keep people safe eventually. It'll just be a little while.
John, can you tell us a little about how you ended up starting your work in autonomous vehicles?
Sure. My path was a little bit different in that I was working for a long time in field robotics and related sorts of things. And then back in the mid 2000s, around 2005 or 6, a team was getting put together at CMU for the DARPA Urban Challenge. And prior to that, Red Whitaker, who had been very successful in a variety of things, including nuclear remediation robots, had been involved with the so-called Grand Challenge, which was a vehicle that needed to drive through the desert, but the hope was it wouldn't have to deal with any other vehicles because it was being let loose before the other or after the other vehicles, whatever, with an appropriate interval. So that was different from this urban challenge where you actually had to interact with other traffic. So I got involved with that. I ended up leading the behaviors team for that, which was doing tactical decision making for the driving, like how do you figure out who goes first at the intersection, and how do you decide when it's time to change lanes, and all those sorts of things. And then in the subsequent years, after we did well in that race, and really that helped in many ways to kick off the current autonomous driving revolution, because a lot of the folks who were involved with that, whether it's CMU or elsewhere, have been those who have started these companies. I've been working a lot, and my lab has been working on, again, these behaviors type of questions. How do you predict what other people in the environment are going to do? So the Pittsburgh left would be an example of that. And you may have prior knowledge there. If you know you're in Pittsburgh, then it's more likely that somebody will try that than elsewhere. And then how do you react to those things, including evasive maneuver, maybe for emergency situations, that kind of thing. Another thing for me that played some role is I have a background in the Army. I was on active duty for 4 years and then in the reserves for a long time. And of course, the Department of Defense has stated, although it hasn't been able to attain the goal, that by a certain date, actually now in the past, they wanted to have a certain percentage of autonomous vehicles. So I've worked at the National Robotics Engineering Center on some projects related to that initiative as well.
So I actually find the two paths here, quite interesting. One, years kind of in from sort of the beginning of the autonomous vehicle sort of revolution, and then kind of seeing it happen kind of in your neighborhood, and then joining into that. I'm actually curious now. So maybe we could speak a little bit. Both of you are working now, and these cars are on the road. Can you tell me a little bit about what are your thoughts about how testing is going? The fact that these cars are really out there, and the information that we're able to gather from both of your perspectives, I think it's really interesting, both from the technology and from the human side. What are we sort of able to learn because these things are actually on the road today, at least in a testing form? I'll let actually any of you start with that.
Do you want to go first, Carol, or do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I'll go, and then you can fill in all the technical details. So one of the big problems is just the amount of data, is analyzing that data. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. Is yes, we can gather millions and millions and millions of pieces of data, but what do we do with it, and how do we use that to really improve things? So that's, I think that's probably one of the bigger challenges that I see people struggling with, is being able to really use that information adequately. And then there's, if we're on tracks and have much more planned scenarios, that's excellent, because we're practicing, we're improving continuously. But then in the real world, a bicyclist is going to not pass properly, or a human child is going to bounce their ball and chase it. And, things like that in the real world are a very different thing that you can't model as adequately. And doing that in real life, though, is also not appropriate. We shouldn't have self-driving vehicles, interacting with children for the first time in the street, and in real life, and so figuring out ways to be able to adequately test that with simulations and things like that is really important. But we still have just so much to learn and to do. So there's just a lot of challenges. Human behavior, as John was mentioning, we need to be able to predict, but humans are tough. I may step out off that curb, but then I may change my mind. I may see a friend and I may turn, and it's tough to predict all of what is going to happen. As we all know, those of us who have driven, sometimes people just do wacky things, and it's tough.
Yeah, I think Carol hit the important themes. So there are different ways to approach it. One would be the one that Carol mostly described, of you either try to come up with in simulation as many possible scenarios as you can imagine, or you take real data and you try to make sure you can do a benign case, and then possibly, you hope that you'll be confronted also in those real data with the unusual cases that might come up when you're driving. But the fact of the matter is, as Carol also said, you can't guarantee that every single possible situation that you might see in the real world is going to come up either in simulation or in your real data. So, but that's one general approach. And that's really the one that I think the autonomous driving companies have been taking for the most part, of doing that sort of thing, then going out in the real world, discovering more cases, coming back, iteratively changing, refining the software to be able to handle these things. And then the question is, where does that put us, or how soon will we be able to asymptotically approach a system that we think is safe enough to be on the road? And that's a tough question to answer. Another way of of approaching it, which is pretty, I'd say in the early stages at this point, would be to try to sort of formally demonstrate that you have what you could call provable safety. Now, it's hard to imagine that that would be able to cover every single case, but there may be some promise in it, and certainly people are working in that area. I'm involved right now with a DARPA project called Assured Autonomy, and the basic idea behind it is to first recognize that there are a lot of learning-enabled components in autonomous systems today, including autonomous cars, and then realize that they're black boxes to some extent. We don't have the same kind of rigorous dynamics equations that we can write down for them that we can for Newtonian mechanics modeled sorts of systems. And therefore, we ask ourselves, can we make any kind of guarantees about their safety? And so we're just starting to look at that. And maybe that'll bear fruit in the future, and these two different approaches can be married up with one another in order to create an overall more safe system. But it's an open question, I think, at this point. And another open question, which is not so much technical, and one that I'll bet Carol has some good things to say about, and I've thought about myself, is what will the public accept, right? Because it may be that they would not accept the same level of safety in an autonomous vehicle that we currently accept for human driving. It would need to be better, perhaps, for human psychology.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Yeah, and the alternative, or the opposite, I guess, situation is what is acceptable operation. So back when you could drive through Times Square, or if you imagine very, very heavily populated areas, if everyone's jaywalking, the vehicles may never move forward, like because it's overly cautious. So they're both sides. So there's what is acceptable safety. Certainly, personally, I think they should be better than us, or what's the point? But on the other side, what's appropriate aggressiveness? How can we make these vehicles, get me to the store or get me to my appointment, my interview, whatever it is, on time, and the route I want, and in the comfort I want, not hard braking, softer braking, whatever it is. Thinking about all of those features and functions is important as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. I have a quick funny story about that from when we were testing around the Pittsburgh airport. The speed limit when you're driving near the airport to drop people off or to drop your car off is 15 miles an hour. We were driving autonomously and we were adhering to the speed limit. Nobody was happy with us. We were getting people honking at us, et cetera. So if you drive at 15 miles an hour, at least from a psychological standpoint, you run the danger of inducing road rage. So it's not always good to follow the rules.
This is actually, there's stories about some other companies' vehicles that have had similar issues where any incidents they've been a part of have been rear-ending incidents because the drivers behind them aren't used to them driving basically at the speed limit on many roads, whether it's 25 or 30 or 40 miles an hour, where people are driving much faster. I actually want to, this is great. There's a question from the audience here that actually leads in to one of the next things is that I'm curious, based on sort of the technology, based on some of what we're seeing from human acceptability, and based on what many people are talking about, right? Many people in industry are saying, that autonomous cars are going to replace human drivers within some time frame. People have all kinds of different time frames. Some people say 5 years, some people say 20 years, some people say longer. Not thinking maybe about the sort of short-term timeline. Do you think that autonomous driving could replace all human driving at some point in the future?
I think it's going to depend on people. I think we need to some extent allow people to make those decisions. I do think there would be a benefit, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but to have autonomous only lanes, autonomous only highways, where the congestion would be significantly reduced, one would expect, because the vehicles ideally could orchestrate together and be a much more effective transportation route. At the same time, I know a lot of people really enjoy driving, and there need to be ways that they can be able to enjoy that aspect, at least within reason. We need to figure out what that is, and I do think that the majority of transportation might turn into autonomous at some point. The other aspect, though, is job security. Bus drivers, people who are doing those kinds of operations. We need to plan if those jobs are to be replaced. How are we going to help them as a community, as a society, to get their next position and manage that as well? And the same with manufacturing and all types of industries where robotics is potentially taking jobs. It's good in some ways that we're keeping people safer. Those jobs are dull, dirty, dangerous, et cetera. But where do we decide or support those people after that point? But I do, again, it will be safer, I think, but it will be 10 to 20 years probably.
Yeah, those are good comments. One thing that is kind of interesting to me is this question of this very trajectory. Like a lot of the stuff that we do in my lab right now assumes the simultaneous presence of human-driven and autonomous cars on the road, where we're trying to figure out what the human drivers might do. And that's, well, probably overall, that's a more potentially dangerous situation than when you have all autonomous cars, as long as the technology has been developed to a certain point and you're able to take advantage of and count on vehicle-to-vehicle communications and that kind of thing. So I think we're inevitably in a situation, because I don't think I agree with Carol that we'll probably have these autonomous corridors and that kind of thing, but I think we'll also have some autonomous cars on the road along with human-driven cars for some period of time. And therefore, the problems that we're working on in my lab, at least for some time, will need to continue to be of concern. But when we get to that, or if we get to that ultimate situation of having all the cars being driven autonomously, we should be able to reap some benefits. I haven't thought deeply about all of them, but one of them might be, well, one of them certainly that's intended would be we could get rid of traffic signals and therefore significantly increase throughput in urban areas and things like that. And there are many others that we could talk about too.
That actually brings up a really interesting point here, which is that in thinking about autonomous vehicle development, many people focus on the vehicles themselves. They focus on the technology that's going into actually making the cars drive on their own. However, John, you've been mentioning a lot about other types of systems that are working in unison with that. So vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure. I'm curious about thoughts that you both might have on what changes we may need to see in things like urban planning, infrastructure to actually support and really maybe move forward autonomous vehicle development, potentially faster or in a way that's just more robust than if the cars are doing everything on their own.
Yeah, well, I'll mention a couple of quick things. I don't really have a sort of comprehensive answer, but I mentioned the ability to get rid of traffic lights, for example, which a lot of people are doing work on, and it seems plausible once you have all of the cars autonomous, because you can have this radio communication. Maybe it'd be based on a particular technology that's pretty popular right now, DSRC, and it communicates around corners, so you don't have to worry about wondering whether a car is coming on the road perpendicular to yours. And that leads to some things that are kind of interesting too, that I don't pretend to be deeply schooled on, but if you're an architect or a city planner and trying to figure out how you're going to make the roads, then you might, because you can have this higher throughput, you might be able to make the roads have fewer lanes or somehow reduce the amount of size that the traffic arteries take up within a city. The one trick about that one is there's a kind of countervailing tendency between the mixed traffic situation I discussed before, where you have both human-driven and autonomous cars, because there you probably want to keep the lines of sight open and make sure that you can, even that the autonomous cars can see other human-driven cars in plenty of time to avoid them and that sort of thing, whereas the full autonomy tends in the other direction, I think. But some other interesting things would be in this Internet of Things environment that we're in, being able to take advantage of people whose cell phone might be using their cell phones while they're walking across the street, not paying attention. You might be able to actually recognize that level of distraction, and probably many other things like that that I've not thought of. I'll turn it over to you, Carol.
Yeah, yeah. I just building, within cities, there could be all types of communications between vehicles, between buildings, helping, maybe even warning that, hey, traffic's bad, they're going to be late, those sorts of things. But people need to have control as well over that experience. And so figuring out what that balance is. Um, I do think that the potential as well for that, as you mentioned, like more space, more human space. Those if it's a vehicle that a human doesn't need to drive, it doesn't necessarily matter as much what that road is. Is the road underground? Is the road, in another maybe less desirable road, but giving more green space to people, giving more walking spaces to people, better environments for humans to move around as well.
Yeah, another idea on that one, of course, is that many people have been looking at is reducing the number of parking garages that you need, because you might be able to basically move them outside the main city downtown area and then have the car autonomously go back and forth between the places that they're parking.
Yeah.
In that regard, actually, Carol, I was wondering if maybe, this idea that autonomous vehicles could potentially also reshape or be a component of reshaping urban space. I'm also wondering, do you have thoughts about what type of, interactions are people going to be having with these vehicles? You presented a potential option here where it's like, wait, we don't even see the cars, right? They're underground. But I'm curious if, maybe barring that kind of solution, do you have thoughts on sort of the other interactions that people might have when they're not in the vehicles? So as pedestrians.
Yeah, certainly. So thinking about people coming to a four-way stop sign, humans need to cross the street, just determining how do I know that that vehicle sees me? With a human driving, the human sometimes uses their hand or there's some sort of eye contact. Sometimes we misunderstand, but usually that there's some understanding between the driver and the pedestrian. But how do we convey that? People have looked at using lights and other types of ways to communicate, but we need to figure out how to keep that as clear as possible. And another thing I was thinking about when you were talking was the idea of car sharing. My car just sits because I'm working from home, and so I have a friend who borrows it once in a while, and if they're autonomous vehicles that we can just schedule and they just show up. They're already existing car sharing programs, but it's even easier if it actually comes to me instead of me chasing it down, going a couple blocks to pick up the car. Instead, it comes to me, and what might that be like to be able to always have the car I want available, but not having to worry about having a garage. In Pittsburgh, most people don't have garages, so.
John, I'm curious, if you have any thoughts there, especially given the work that you've been doing, in looking at the interactions that, say, human driven vehicles. Have you also been looking at how pedestrians might interact with autonomous vehicles and how that may change the way in which autonomous vehicles are going to behave?
Yeah, my lab and my students haven't really been looking at that so much, but there is work that's going on in the Robotics Institute, for example, on again, using sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence techniques to predict how people are going to move, and both when they're moving individually, which actually can be fairly unpredictable because humans have low momentum, right? Not like a car, so you can suddenly make a direction change at a corner and surprise bystanders. But then also in groups, and even not just for autonomous driving, but some of the work is applicable, like social dynamics when people are gathered in groups. What sorts of distances do they keep with one another? How can we judge from looking at them that one person is actually in conversation with a X number of other people versus another group that might be nearby? So some of that is applicable, I think, to what happens in these complex pedestrian situations in places like New York City when people are crossing streets and that kind of thing.
So this actually leads me, I think, into kind of the next part of the discussion, which is in looking forward, where are some of the areas where there needs to be sort of more innovation, more research? Like what are areas we don't have a lot of good answers to? And this could be on the technology side, this could be on human machine interaction. I'm curious to know, like in the next sort of decade, where is a fruitful research area that hopefully will make a good positive step in actually realizing a vision of having more autonomous vehicles on the road?
I can take a couple quickly. One of them we've already touched on, and I'll take that second. But the first one would be perception in general, and I'll just give some specific examples. Of course, a lot of advances have been made. If you go back to let's say the 70s, the 80s for computer vision, you were just segmenting out different objects in a particular scene, and then maybe you'd be able to say that it was separate from the rest of the scene, a book, a cup, or whatever else. In recent times, in particular with some of the machine learning and deep learning techniques, there's been a lot of progress towards scene understanding in a way that's more comparable to that in which humans are capable of doing it. But there's still lots to be done in terms of reasoning about a scene that we see. I guess one way to think about this that is instructive, I think, is that if we pick up a rental car, let's say we travel to Shanghai and we pick up a rental car and we have to go somewhere, it's nice to have a map, and of course it's great to have GPS nowadays, but as humans, we're able to just kind of meander through a city. We recognize places where we need to turn, and we can figure a lot of things out from the semantics of the situation, the way things are laid out. Whereas currently, autonomous cars really depend on a very specific and detailed map in order to do what they're doing. I'm not saying we should throw that out, but it would be a sort of advanced capability would be for an autonomous car to deal with an environment in which it doesn't have a map and still to be able to do well. And we're not there. But this kind of perception I'm talking about that does scene interpretation, scene understanding will be a big advance in that direction. Another thing that is kind of related is this whole question of LiDAR, laser sensors, which Elon Musk and Tesla have sworn off very explicitly. And so there's a question of whether or not there's a technology race right now in order to make LiDAR cheaper. And if that's successful, that'd be a game changer. And it looks like there are some companies that are doing quite well in that area. And then there are others who are trying to do without LiDAR and see if that is possible. So that's one big area of perception. I think there'll be continuing developments in that area. The second one is the safety that we talked about already. And I alluded to a couple of the approaches that have been taken to that. But if some of these, well, one thing I didn't mention, it's a little bit different from the formal verification, is control methods that use machine learning in order to create what are called safety indexes or control barrier functions, which are a certain method of ensuring safety under certain conditions. So these are relatively recent techniques that are being combined with machine learning techniques that may be able to increase the safety and sort of the provable safety, or at least the mathematically justifiable safety of cars in the future. I think a lot of work will continue to be done over the coming years in that area.
Yeah. And building on that, I think that that human machine communication is going to be key in the near term, particularly while we have these assistive compilations of assistive systems in these vehicles. How do we communicate what the current situation is to the humans involved? How do we help people understand the limitations of the vehicles and where the end points are of what it can do and what can potentially be a hazardous situation, and really working to help improve that communication piece. And then once these vehicles are fully autonomous, which again will be a while, how do we then communicate with the human? So for example, if I have set, the vehicle is going to take me to my office in the morning, and I forgot my glasses. How do I communicate to the vehicle? Stop, go around the block, go back. I need to get that. Then we'll commence with a cab driver, with an Uber, with whatever. You can do that right now. How do you do those kinds of strange alternative types of communications with these vehicles? So there's lots of work between the humans and the machines that we need to figure out.
This actually, there's a question from the audience here that I think fits well with this, regarding the fact that many autonomous vehicles don't have a great sort of understanding of their surroundings or an understanding of people. the question is would developing a general AI that understands human nuances move autonomous driving forward? And I think one other aspect of this, or to just add a little bit there, is that how have you both seen kind of the developments in AI? You know, John, you had mentioned sort of the deep learning revolution, but I'm curious about both your thoughts in this regard of understanding the nuances of people, understanding the nuances of scenes, and maybe some of the advancements in artificial intelligence that might help move that forward.
Yeah, I think the way that I would briefly characterize it is that even though there have been a lot of advances with deep learning in terms of improving prediction algorithms and various other things, we're still very far from the so-called general intelligence, right, that people have been talking about since the 50s establishing. So we have a lot of components, and none of the components in itself has anything close to what a human being can do in new situations in terms of flexibility. And there are also architectural issues with putting all the components together. This shows up even in the assistive driving things that Carol just mentioned, the ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems. If you put together a lane keeping, let's say you put together, any two of them. I mean, you can think of some situations where they conflict with one another, but they're not designed to work with one another in any event, let's put it that way. And so on the other hand, the autonomous driving companies are trying to put everything together, but we don't have anything comparable to the way that a human sees an entire situation. There are many complex things happening, makes a unified decision, so to speak, or a decision that unifies all the complexity of the situation and deals with it. So I think there's promise, but I don't want to give the impression, I don't think anybody in AI should give the impression that we already have something close to a general intelligence. And I think there are really just some significant barriers to that. There are others who are much more optimistic. One of my colleagues, Hans Moravec, has been writing books about for years about how this is around the corner. And I think tremendous progress has been made, but it's still hard to imagine creating a computing system that has anything close to the aggregate capabilities of a human being.
Yeah, and building on that, I tend to be someone who is pretty skeptical about the benefit of a general intelligence system, mostly because all of a sudden we're creating another potential being. And if we do that, they're not going to want to be our slaves. That's going to create a whole nother level of problem. So there's a fine line between a system that can comprehend and understand what is around it, the system, situations, all of that, and actually being sentient, and figuring out where that line is a whole different line of research. And we need to think about the implications of even doing that. Is that really something as humans we should be doing? Is that, with all the implications that there are?
Yeah.
So I actually want to talk a little now about kind of what's happening and what's going on currently today, because I think we've been using the term, autonomous vehicles, and I think many people do imagine that as a what is called full self-driving. So the car can drive completely on its own. There's no driver intervention whatsoever. In the language of SAE levels, that would be level 5. However, I think today we actually have a spectrum of autonomous technologies that are functioning on the roads. Some of those being those advanced driver assistance systems, so ADAS, and those are lower levels of autonomy. Systems that are being purported to be more full self-driving, like from companies like Tesla. I'm actually really curious to hear your thoughts on sort of, given the fact that the technologies are making their ways into cars today, how is that going to affect sort of even just human-driven driving? Where do you see maybe some positives of these technologies coming in, and are there any potential negatives of these technologies actually being introduced potentially too early or in a way that hasn't been fully thought through? Carol, I wonder if you want to start with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So certainly, if you've bought a new car recently or rented a car recently that has lane keeping and some of these other technologies, certainly, I think I have greatly benefited from the better braking systems that are available in the newer cars instead of locking my brakes as I did in my youth. These systems can certainly keep us safer, keep us more aware of our surroundings, and support better driving for sure. The problems come in when you're sharing a vehicle, I think, and perhaps someone has deactivated one of these systems unbeknownst to you. You get in the vehicle, you are used to the vehicle doing something, much like if you think of lights, someone borrows your car and they turn the lights into a different position and now they're off and you didn't realize it. And so in some cities, you can drive for quite a while before you realize your lights aren't on. These are the kinds of things where we need to make sure that the status is available to people, that they can be made aware of the situation so that they know what is working, what is not working, and don't, as long as humans really are still responsible for the vehicle, and they will be for the near future. If they're in that operator position, or if they're not, someone is anyway responsible for the movement of that vehicle regardless. They need to also be aware of those limitations and what is supporting their work, and what is potentially has degraded for some reason, and is no longer working the way that it has in the past, and communicating those types of information, much like the tire sensors in most cars now. They warn you if the pressure is low, so that you're aware. Like, those types of indicators are really going to be much more important with these systems, depending on the urgency.
Yeah. I just have one follow-on related to Tesla. It's related to what Carol said. So I think if we look at the different Tesla accidents that have occurred, what typically happens is that Tesla says, well, we told people that they needed to have their hands on the wheel all the time. They needed to pay attention. They needed to recognize what the vehicle could do, just like Carol was saying. And it's true. That's part of what they say. But I think one thing that's missed there, and that Tesla hasn't really faced up to in any of the public statements that I've seen, is that if a car works 90% of the time in maybe it's benign situations, typically on sunny California highways, then you start to induce a psychological expectation that it's going to work for the other 10% of the time. And of course, you shouldn't do absurd things like apparently these two folks did, that got into the back seat of a Tesla and let it drive by itself, and unfortunately were killed. But it's understandable that it would lead to certain psychological responses. And I think that's maybe, I'm sure some people have talked about this, maybe commentators, but I think it's a little bit too glib for Tesla just to say, well, we told you shouldn't do that. There needs to be some additional things happening there. I'm not sure what they need to be. I mean, an extreme thing would be to just pull back and not provide as much autonomous capability as Tesla is until the public is ready to handle it properly. But I don't know what the best way to deal with it is. I just feel like it is a legitimate problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there are different models that companies have put forward. Tesla seems to put forward sort of this vision of full self-driving. The car really is taking over, driving on its own. Other companies have put more sort of supervisory visions. For example, I know that the Toyota Research Institute has their Guardian vision, where actually many of these technologies are actually there to kind of act as true safety measures, that actually you're driving still, and that they sort of kick in to kind of keep the humans safe. Right. And I think that there's sort of a spectrum here in regards to that. I wonder a little bit, does there need to be sort of any maybe regulatory action or some type of governing body that maybe starts to get involved to help kind of guide the industry forward? I mean, I know at least here in the U.S., we generally allow the private industry to be innovative, move things forward. But I'm curious, because we're in public space, and this are huge systems, roadways, so many people are involved. I wonder if you might have thoughts about how does regulation play into kind of helping innovation move forward, but in a safe manner.
Yeah, I do think that some regulation is going to need to be required, mostly because the approaches so far have just been inadequate. Generally, unfortunately, that's the way that things need to be for people to do the right thing in some cases. But what that looks like and how do we manage to support innovation and continue people doing really good research and really pushing what these systems are capable of, and keeping people safe. It's a balance, and certainly not my area of expertise, but I do think that that it needs to be done minimally. That the situation that John was describing, where humans naturally we want to push boundaries. We sometimes don't act the way we should. We go ahead and eat that sandwich while we're driving, even without the self-driving aspect. So with self-driving, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be watching that movie, we're going to be reading a book, we're going to be doing whatever it is we want to do, because we've got that sense of safety. But that's not a safe situation, because that system could turn off or immediately need your attention, and you can't put that book down that quickly. To be able to do that. So it's really going to be interesting to figure out how do we help people use these systems in a better way, and how do we make the people who manufacturing these systems ensure that that's the case. And some of this is from eye tracking, that there are all kinds of systems that could be used, but then there's also the privacy questions. How do we maintain people's privacy? Where does that data go? What information is shared with whom? Particularly if I'm having passengers in my car who don't realize we're being monitored. There are a lot of questions in there. There certainly is technology available to make this work, but how do we balance those all the complexities?
Yeah, I think one thing that folks may be aware of to some extent that has been happening in recent years is that there's been some good work both by the Department of Transportation and then also by engineering organizations in order to create some safety standards. So the Department of Transportation has come out with, I think, 3 different documents. They had a vision for safety 2.0, and then they had a follow-on to that. And I've read through them. I think they're good. They don't purport to be directive. They're not saying you must do this. Maybe they have a few things that they say people have to do, but it's mainly, these are good practices, please follow them. So they're trying to avoid quashing creativity, I guess, like you were alluding to, Nick. And then at the same time, there've been, well, there's an older standard, ISO 26262, not super old, but then there's a more recent one. Now I have the numbers wrong. Is it UL 4600 or 6400? I always get mixed up, but it's meant to encourage autonomous car creators to create a safety case for what they're producing and what they're fielding. So again, I think it's good, it's strong. Actually, one of my colleagues, Professor Phil Koopman in the ECE department is one of the leaders in this area, and Mike Wagner, they're both at EdgeCase Research. So I think it's a good initiative, but it's not at the point, I'm not sure you can be at the point of saying, you need to do steps 1 through 10 and meet these quantitative guidelines in order to put your car on the road. That's a little bit harder to do, I guess, partly because what we alluded to before, that there's so many different things that could happen, that could be a seemingly infinite test environment or test bed that you need to fulfill.
So in kind of building on, this topic of sort of regulation and maybe sort of these, larger systems that might need to be put in place. We do have some questions from the audience, and we also wanted to discuss this as well, was around sort of maybe the larger sort of ethical implications of autonomous vehicles. And I think that there are different aspects of ethics to consider here. Some in regards to, all of course in regards to people, but some in regards to, say, ethical actions that happen for the passengers of those vehicles, for pedestrians, for other cars, but also for even the larger systems involved, say, for example, like the environment, things like there. I'm curious about any thoughts that you both have in regards to kind of the ethics of autonomous vehicles.
Carol, I'm
Yeah,
gonna let you start because I know you've thought about that.
yeah, it's definitely something I'm very, very interested in. And yeah, the initial aspects about building these systems, how do we build them in ways that support human values that really are good, good vehicles in all the sense of that word, and that they are behaving in ways that we believe are right, given the culture that we're in, given the community, the situation, and that has to be baked into the system at an early stage. So that's a lot of that work really has to be thought about very early. There are discussions of the trolley problem. You may have seen the MIT morality project, where you can actually test out like different variations on incidents and how to make a choice between, not to be too graphic, but between hitting the babies and dogs or hitting the nuns. And these really aren't appropriate discussions with regard to self-driving, because at that point it's too late. If there's really an urgent emergent situation, the vehicle ideally should stop. And as anyone who's been in an incident probably knows, at that point you're not making ethical decisions. You're desperately trying to gain control of the situation and to avoid risk to yourself as well as everyone else. It's not an ethical choice at that point. So that work really needs to be done very early on. And then as for dealing with other vehicles, with humans in general, I mean, it's going to always be very subjective. Was the person behind the wheel paying attention? Were they in control? Were they doing the right thing? And sometimes, no matter what, accidents happen, crashes happen. But we need to have those the ideas in place of how to deal with these situations early. And right now it is the operator. The operator is the person who is responsible. They are the ones who need to maintain control, and they are responsible if something happens with that vehicle. In the incident in Texas this past week, I don't know which human, and it unfortunately it doesn't matter at this point, but that type of situation, we're going to have to figure out what do you do when no one is in that vehicle's position, but someone is responsible and should have been responsible. And that's difficult. The other situations to think about, if something is actually wrong with the vehicle, as we saw with Boeing planes, in the past, there actually was a situation where the humans didn't have the knowledge or the awareness of how to actually fix the problem. And that could certainly be happening with some of these vehicles as well. And how do you manage that situation, the liability, as well as just, is that even a way to design anything? We need to make sure that the humans can maintain control, can take over if necessary at all times. I think that's the most important part of the ethics is making sure that humans are able to maintain control for as long as these vehicles aren't truly autonomous.
Yeah, I think Carol did a great job of covering that aspect of it. I guess maybe one other aspect of the ethics that we touched on earlier, and that she had also mentioned, has to do with employment or loss of employment from the deployment of autonomous vehicles. I just wanted to throw one thing out on that. There are two basic schools of thought, it seems like. One would be that this is no different from other economic revolutions. It's going to happen fairly gradually, or at least gradually enough that there will be opportunities for people to be retrained and find other employment. Many times in the past this has happened. We don't have buggy whip manufacturers anymore. The other school of thought would be this is going to be unique. This is going to be the fastest such revolution in history, and that therefore could have devastating consequences, and we need to be specially prepared for it. And I'm not sure which of those is true. From the technological standpoint, I think it's happening more slowly than we expected and we're saying 5 years ago. But I don't think we've always been good in any event at retraining people or offering those kinds of opportunities. So there are always these questions of, to what extent should the government be involved? To what extent should companies be foreseeing what's going to happen and providing opportunities for their employees to be ready for the future? And those are important questions that I don't think can be governed entirely by individual companies' bottom lines. They are a societal responsibility.
So I know that we've been, as part of this, we're thinking a little bit about some of the things that could potentially, go wrong. And I guess there's maybe, I think it's actually a healthy thing to think about the potential downsides of new technology, such that we can start to mitigate some of those issues that might arise. I wonder now, I want to maybe just as our final, before we switch completely into our questions from the audience, maybe and ending on a somewhat of a positive note for our question period is, assuming that we really do achieve autonomous vehicles sometime in the future, what is the most positive aspect of this sort of revolution that you see? And it could be in any part. It could be for people. It could be for the way that we do travel. It could be the way that we actually spend our time in vehicles. I'm just curious, what are some of the more kind of positive, or the most positive thing that you're excited about in regards to autonomous driving?
Well, the two that immediately come to my mind, and there's nothing revolutionary about them. I think you touched on at least one, maybe both there. But one would be, we know that over 1 million people a year are killed worldwide in automobile crashes. It's 37 to 40,000 a year in the United States. And reducing that would be a wonderful blessing, right? So that's important. And then the other one you mentioned there, I think we do spend a lot of time. On the one hand, Americans and Germans are notorious for loving to drive. But on the other hand, it would be nice to recover some of that time. I love to read and do other things. So travel time, like I don't mind flying to China for 15 hours because I can catch up on some reading, right? So if we can do that in our cars or whatever else we want to do, I think that's a great benefit. And there are many others, but those are the two that immediately leapt to my mind.
Carol?
Oh, sorry. I was having trouble unmuting. My cats are trying to participate. So I think that some of the other benefits might be just car sharing, easier abilities to get where you need to go. So an example, I was working with an individual who had poor vision, and he regularly with his wife would go to a different state to teach a course. She would go anyway. And one of the issues was she could get there. She could get an Uber to take her, or whatever vehicle. So she could get someone to take her to that school that she was teaching, but she couldn't get somebody to bring her back to Pittsburgh. And so those kinds of trips, my parents live in West Virginia, and there's not a lot of transportation between here and the city they live in. If I could order an autonomous vehicle to pick them up, and it could wait outside until they were ready and nobody's complaining, and then bring them to me, and then when it's time, take them back home. It opens up dramatic potential for transportation to places that typically are very difficult for people to be able to get transportation from. So I'm really looking forward to that ability as well. No more bored, annoyed drivers waiting and then leaving you in the middle of nowhere because they just couldn't wait anymore. So I think that will make everybody happy.
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned, those who may have disabilities, that autonomous vehicles could allow them to travel independently. I know, John, you had mentioned that before. I'll say personally, so my research is actually looking into this. I'm leading a project looking at how those who are disabled, who have sensory mobility or cognitive disability would be able to actually communicate and control and basically take independent rides in autonomous vehicles. I'm personally very excited about that. And that actually comes up, a question from the audience here is, do we really think that this type of smart commuting can help disabled people? And maybe a question there is, what would it take and for those who have disabilities or who have low mobility to actually trust these vehicles? Because it's slightly different in some regards from maybe those who can drive today learning to trust an autonomous vehicle versus those who rely on other forms of transportation or other people to actually learn to maybe independently trust this. Curious about any thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very personal. But some of the people I've spoken with are actually very excited to not have to talk to a human, to not have to explain things to someone else, and to be able to have the freedom. If they want to go to the bar at 2 a.m., they go to the bar at 2 a.m. and no one's judging, why is this person going to do this thing? And that is a sense of freedom that many people have never had in their lives. They've always been reliant on other people to transport them and to get them where they need to go. So the freedom and the independence that it offers is incredible. How someone who has low vision, finds that vehicle. Thankfully, we are every day improving cell phones and techniques to be able to really localize on things. So we're getting there. I don't think that will be such an issue. But individually, different people have different levels of trust anyway. So it's going to be probably a small group initially. And then as things, as people have better stories to tell and good experiences, hopefully it will grow and expand in use.
Yeah, I agree with Carol. I think to me, there are two basic lines of evidence, right? One is personal experience. If you have been able to drive in the car and it seemed safe and you've done it multiple times, and probably one hopes in more benign situations at first. That's one of the reasons that a lot of the planned or actual deployments are maybe local shuttles or things that aren't going to face as difficult traffic environments. So there's the personal experience, and that's really the way to build trust. And then for the other line of evidence would be statistical. We want to be able, and this is kind of difficult to do. I think some of the claims that Tesla has made based on their X number of miles of safe driving have not really been compelling. There have been some criticism made of them. But if we could say plausibly, the way we do about air travel, that there's a certain accident rate for autonomous cars and it's much lower than human driving, then that's a piece of evidence that may not be appealing to some, but for certain mindsets, that's fairly comforting and might induce them to be more ready to use those means of transportation.
Another question that I have here is in regards to sort of that personal experience. Have both of you actually ridden in any form of sort of autonomous, vehicle? I know I have. I'm actually be really interested to hear maybe some of your own experiences. Like, what was it like the first time that you were in a vehicle that you weren't driving yourself?
Yeah, and my experience is mostly limited to the Uber ATG's vehicles, but it was surprisingly comfortable and smooth, and certainly limited, but it's still really a positive experience overall. I also got to take some training behind the wheel as the operator, taking over in modeled emergent situations on a track, and that was really interesting to see the limits, to understand for myself what it took. These are relatively large Volvos, so they're heavy vehicles to begin with, and being able to integrate with that system, to team with that system, I should say, was really really interesting to understand the limitations from that point of view.
Yeah, and for me, I've been in all the cars that we developed at CMU, the boss vehicle that we developed for the race, and that one was kind of interesting because, as I just said, it was developed for a race. So if you spent a lot of time in there, you either had to develop an iron stomach or you were going to get sick because it was high acceleration and deceleration. So that was, designed for a specific purpose. But then a later Cadillac that we retrofitted, spent a lot of time in that. I also been in the Waymo and the Argo vehicles. And I think, yeah, my experience is similar to Carol's. Generally, it works well. Of course, there's still situations where the safety driver needs to intervene, and those are, we talked about them already. Some, the fact that we just can't deal with every situation, and it's not even only the so-called long tail, really unusual situations. It's things that come up in everyday driving still, and the companies are trying to reduce the frequency of such interventions, but that takes time, and it's going in that incremental way that we've talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting that both of you kind of mentioned how you've been in it. Johnny, I think the having the iron stomach. So my experience in so I've driven Teslas, and arguably those are low level of self-driving. Although you can take your hands off the wheel and let it drive. And I remember sitting there being like I guess I wouldn't call it a white knuckle in the sense of like holding onto the wheel, because I wasn't, but it was definitely a little bit nerve-wracking. Although it was interesting that over time you would start to relax and you'd start to get comfortable. One of the things I do wonder here is that there's so much excitement around the technology, and I think there's a lot of real potential here for changes in safety, but that in some ways the actual experience that people may have eventually will be quite unremarkable. Although this has been the trend in sort of, I think, major advancements in computing, is that something like our mobile phones, it was amazing that we could put so much power and computing into a handheld device, and now today it's almost unremarkable. What the capabilities that we have, even 15 years later. And I do wonder if things may move in that direction, where eventually things will become sort of it becomes an unremarkable technology, and that may be the goal in some ways.
Yeah, and many of the studies I did, I saw that happening with people dramatically quickly, where they would just be like, it's cool. And very, very quickly adapting, because humans do. We adapt very, very quickly. And an interesting point you brought up was motion sickness, and that's going to be a big issue. I think women and interestingly Asians tend to have the highest levels of motion sickness, and it's something that subsides with age, and children, of course. But it's going to be a significant factor as well. Is how do we minimize that motion so that not only obviously these vehicles we expect will move in ways that hopefully don't make everyone ill, but also make sure that there's adequate windows, make sure that there's adequate ventilation, that sort of thing, to keep most people comfortable.
Yeah.
That's it. Actually, I'll say, I think that's a really interesting point. Some of the work that I did a few years ago, we were looking at basically the adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, and then thinking about what is actually perceptually smooth or comfortable for humans. And actually, I was working with some control engineers at Renault Nissan, and I sort of built some remote observation systems, because they were working on okay, well, we can mathematically define this is how quickly it should brake, how smoothly it should brake, how it should accelerate, but then what does it actually feel like for that person in the vehicle? And I'm personally really excited about kind of future research and sort of understanding that those human factor sides of things, and merging that really with the technical kind of controls work to say, okay, well, this is how we can define sort of how the vehicle dynamics are sort of operating, but that we know and have sort of a model of like what is going to be comfortable for our passengers. And that could be, individual. There's definitely people who are more or less susceptible. There's also the element of sort of what is the experience of driving. I mean, for example, many of the autonomous vehicle development work has also been kind of in parallel and is starting to maybe merge with electric vehicle development. Of course, Teslas are electric vehicles. Being an electric vehicle is kind of amazing. It's like the dynamics that you can have, the accelerations, the forces. It's fun. It actually can be quite a fun experience, or it could be an amazingly smooth and quiet experience. So I'm really excited about that. John, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, especially on the technical side, right? How are people kind of thinking about kind of those control systems in regards to, say, the human factors of like what is perceptually kind of comfortable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a great deal of collaborative research between, let's say, control theorists and human machine interaction experts. However, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but I just don't know of any off the top of my head. However, there's no doubt that the typical motion planner is going to optimize on the basis of an objective function. And the objective function is going to, I'd say, inevitably include terms that involve accelerations, both lateral and longitudinal. And then usually what we do is we look up something from, I don't know, OSHA or whoever publishes the standards about what the maximum such accelerations might be. And we might go one derivative further and be minimizing jerk, not just acceleration. So those things all go into the objective function, but I think it's without a great deal of expertise from the human factor side, where I think probably there could be fruitful collaborations that would make that more sophisticated and better along the lines of what you were just describing.
So we have some more questions coming in from the audience, and I'd like to remind our audience, please feel free to use the question and answer feature. There's a question here around, we had talked earlier about maybe there'd be lanes for autonomous driving, like maybe like biking lanes. And I wonder if in thinking about kind of the way that our roads are set up today and how roads could basically be done in the future, do we see this as something as kind of incremental? We'll start to see certain lanes. Will those lanes need to be augmented with anything? Or do we imagine that there may be new sort of infrastructure development for this? And Carol, you had mentioned at some point, maybe we'll start, putting roads underground. Of course, that is, a reality that, Elon Musk is also planning on. I'm curious though, in regards to sort of separate lanes versus working on the roads that we have now, what would it take to get there? And is that going to be kind of an efficient path forward?
Yeah, I mean, the maintenance that's currently required in our cities is such a significant portion of the expenses for any city. Realistically, I don't see that happening. However, there are new cities being built, I believe in China and Russia, I could be wrong, but where they're specifically building them with the expectation of autonomous vehicle movement in certain sections and that sort of thing. And so that seems to be probably a more realistic model than retrofitting our cities with even more lanes. It's gonna depend how quickly this technology really does come to fruition. The high occupancy lanes that are currently in our cities potentially could be converted to being for self-driving vehicles. I could see that being one way to manage it if the benefits are there, and that the cities see that is a way to go, because that effectively would be a very similar use. Ideally, there would be high occupancy in those vehicles as well, but just figuring out how to do that is tough, though.
Yeah, a quick bit on the history. The Berkeley Path project back in the 90s actually depended on infrastructure changes and had magnetic objects in the road in order to be able to help with lane following. And although that was a successful project overall and there's continuing research on it, I think the basic verdict was that trying to change infrastructure in the US anyway, as Carol was alluding to, is too expensive and we need to do it a different way. Of course, doing it the different way leads to all kinds of technological problems, which we're facing now as we're trying to make this a reality. But I'll just cite one of them. So if we were to use the HOV lanes, which makes sense, or something like that on the highway, then one thing we want to make sure is that we, particularly in places like Arizona where the sun tends to fade the lane markings, that we have some way, maybe through a better technology, better paint, whatever, of making a very clear marker that delineates the lane. Then we don't have to constantly be repairing that or refreshing it for the autonomous car to be able to use.
Another question from the audience, and this is quite interesting, around kind of the economics of autonomous vehicles. And I'll say that this is probably a pretty speculative area, but I think it's fair to engage with. Is one question here is, do we think that autonomous vehicles may enlarge the gap between the wealthy and the poor? Or that access to such technology is going to be quite split among those with sort of financial means and those that don't. At the same time, I'll add on to this a little bit, though, that there have been other visions that this could actually improve equity in regards to transportation access, as we talked about earlier, say for those who are disabled. Right now, they rely on only certain numbers of systems. This can actually limit, their ability to say work in certain areas that autonomous vehicles might allow them to actually have more freedom, and that could ultimately provide more financial freedom. I'm curious about maybe thoughts that you both have in regards to sort of the nature of the economics for individuals of autonomous vehicles.
I'll be glad to go first on this one. I just have some brief remarks. I think for personal cars, for personal vehicles, it will be the case that wealthier people will be able to get access to it more quickly. We know that from Tesla cars, right? They're more expensive than average cars, and they have the autopilot on them. But I would say that personal cars are not necessarily the best business plan for introducing autonomous technology. I don't think that, because of the expense involved, it's going to have to be gradually introduced there. And I don't know that, well, there's some advantages to it, as we've talked about, but it's perhaps not as important as the ride sharing that Carol had talked about, or the long range trucking. And if we look at the ride sharing, then I think, as you were just saying, Nick, that should be open to all, right? Uber's model is to drive those prices down to be pretty low. So I think there's not a single answer, right? It depends on the segment of the market that we're talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. The choices that we make as a society are going to determine that, but certainly more expensive vehicles clearly are not going to be available to everyone. But I think that we can make huge progress in making equitable transportation a reality with the autonomous vehicles.
All right. Well, we're actually at time. I think that was a nice way to end the discussion. I want to thank John and Carol for all of your thoughts, for engaging in the questions that I had, also the questions that our audience had. I'd like to also thank our audience for asking such great questions. I think everyone here is really thinking deeply about what the future might bring with sort of the autonomous vehicle revolution. I'm excited to see where things go. I'm excited personally to see research and development in this area, and eventually see more vehicles on the road, such that we can achieve some of these kind of aspirational goals of equitable transportation, safer transportation, and sort of better roadways. So I think with that, we'll end. Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing what happens in the future.
Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.